This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. One of the more influential minds of our modern era, the last 25, 30 years, Daniel Goleman, my guest today, the author of a book that you probably have purchased, Emotional Intelligence. Today we talk his newest work, Optimal, which is all about the application of emotional intelligence in our personal lives, our work lives. Great stuff. Really nice conversation. I'm very fortunate to have this podcast. The chance to talk with so many accomplished, wise, smart people. Man, I am one lucky guy. Without any further delay from me, please enjoy this conversation with Daniel Goleman. Listen, just to share with you also, you might not be aware of this, but I happen to be in a corner of the world right now, a Buddhist country very close to, I think, countries that you've spent a lot of time in. I'm in Saigon, Vietnam today.
Why are you in Vietnam? Why are you in Saigon?
So I live here last 11 years.
Is that right? Oh, my God. And you do this for a living or what?
Well, I wrote a bunch of investment books and I started the podcast talking to traders, and then I got bored. And actually, it was Daniel Goleman who agreed to come on, who then opened the door to the podcast being much wider. That was probably in 2014.
Oh, you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah, I know you're fond of this part of the world. And I must say, I'm not a practicing Buddhist by any stretch, but after living in a place like Vietnam for so long, I like to say that I've become a Buddhist by osmosis.
It's funny because isn't Vietnam about half Christian too?
It's actually only about 5% Catholic.
You're kidding.
No. Even though some of the most prominent pieces of land and cathedrals you'll see in the city, but generally it's only about 5% Catholic.
I didn't realize that. I know Thich Nhat Hanh went back to his monastery there to die. I don't know if you had any contact with those people.
I did not. I have many friends who are big fans. Yes, I know he passed. Made a big dent on the world for sure.
Yeah, he was very prominent. Anyway, oh, great. Well, I've never been to Vietnam, but good for you.
I figured I know there are parts of this world that you enjoy a lot. Thought I'd share.
I've been to India a lot. Yeah, that's true.
So listen, I got to tell you, back in the day, let's say the 90s, when a guy like you started to blow up, I remember picking up your book. And I remember thinking it spoke to me because I was a guy that was not with the great grades and maybe a little bored in school, but I felt like I had this skill. I felt like I had this ability to communicate and whatnot, but I did not feel rewarded at all. And when I saw your work, I'm not saying this is exactly where emotional intelligence went, but I thought, well, gosh, here's somebody who's telling me that pure memorization is not the only quest in life, is not the only thing you need. There's something more. And I was like, And I remember telling people for years about this book. I don't know if anybody ever listened to me, but I know a lot of other people found about your work regardless of me. But I just want to share that. It was really, I think it made a strong impression on me back in the day.
I've heard this from a lot of people. People will say, wow, when I was in school, I always felt bad because I didn't get the best grades. And now they're making 100,000 times more than their classmates. And it's because how you handle yourself and how you get along with other people matters enormously over the course of life, over the course of your career. But it's way undervalued during school years, definitely.
Yeah, even doing something like this podcast, and this isn't like patting myself on the back or anything, but it's just an entire skill set. It's something that a kid doesn't learn how to maybe take the chance to learn how to communicate, to figure out how to listen, to figure out how to get into the shoes of that other person and then find that connection and being self-aware as to how do other people perceive you. All these things are so terribly important. And I know for you, is still, as a keen observer, it's not as rewarded in the school system or in life as much as it should be.
Well, you're really describing the elements of emotional intelligence, which I should clarify for your listeners. I see as self-awareness, knowing what you're feeling, why you feel it, how it's making you think or perceive, and what you want to do because of that feeling, managing disruptive feelings and marshaling the motivation that helps you achieve your goals, helps you stay optimistic, helps you roll with the punches. All of that, that's all about leading yourself or managing yourself. Then there's empathy, tuning into other people, their emotions, being able to read people and sense how they're feeling, and putting that all together to manage relationships. So when you do a podcast, you have to do all those things. And by the way, Michael, I don't think this is learned in school anywhere. I think it's learned in life. Either you get it, and some people have it from the get-go, or you pick it up as you go along. The school curriculum is all cognitive. It's all technical. Basically, it's a different mode of learning. But it's not the only mode that matters. I think that's the key point.
I'll share with you one way that I got thrown into the fire of seeing what you're talking about, this emotional intelligence. At age 21, while still in college in the DC area, I decided in my infinite wisdom to run for a mayor of the community that I was living in against a man who was 72 years of age. So it got a lot of local press and all that stuff, but it was interesting to deal with people, to talk with people, to hear what they wanted to say, especially much older people that were putting their hopes and dreams on a local politician candidate who was 21 years of age. But all of this really started to wake me up to the whole idea of the feeling and the emotional aspects that go into just living. And it was a strange way to start to go down the path, but that was where I started.
Well, I think that's as good a start as any. You had to pay attention to how people were responding to what you're saying. You had to be able to read their feelings. You had to be able to handle your own. That's really like being thrown into the deep end of the pool. Just to give an example, I was talking to a woman who's a leader at a big pharma, and I wondered how she got so good at leading teams. She said, when I was in middle school, my family moved to a town where I didn't know anyone. And I thought if I played field hockey, I'd meet other kids. And it turned out she was bad at the game, but good at helping the coach. So she became a coach. And when she started working for a big pharma, she was doing sales calls. And once she got the hang of it, she started showing other people how to do it. That was her crucible for learning. And I think each one of us over the course of our lives has had different ones.
Can I ask you to take me back in time to a start? I don't know the exact numbers, but Emotional Intelligence sold millions upon millions of copies, translated into 40 languages. I'm sure I can go down to the bookstore within 2 blocks of where I'm at right now and find it in Vietnamese, 100% sure. Look, no one wakes up as the author of 8 books, but no one wakes up and says, hey, I'm going to sell millions and millions of copies of a book. It's a pretty amazing thing in hindsight. You must be like, wow, I had that happen to me. But there was a start for you. And I don't know whether it's the start of writing the book or the start of you, the start of your aha moment of why is no one really writing about this as I see it? You pick the place where you want to start, and I'll keep peppering you some. But where is the start for this incredible journey?
I always think of it as starting when I became a science journalist. I got my training in clinical psychology, but I never did it. I went into journalism, and I was covering stories about emotions in the brain. And I thought, gee, that might be a good book. I had a kid who was about to go to college. I thought, well, maybe I'll get some tuition money. I didn't expect this book to hit the jackpot the way it did. Now it's in more than 40 languages, actually, including some I didn't even know were languages. It has sold millions of books. But I think I was just lucky, frankly. I think the idea was ready. People read the book and said, oh, yeah, I knew that already, but this gives me language. The article, Emotional Intelligence, the academic article, was written in 1990. I happened to see it because that was my job. I'd read journal articles and translate them for millions of readers. That's a handy skill, by the way. I came upon an article called Emotional Intelligence. It was written by a guy named Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale, his graduate student then. And I thought, emotional intelligence, that's such a great phrase because it's an oxymoron. Those two words shouldn't go together, emotions and intelligence. But I realized it was really being intelligent about emotions. That made a lot of sense to me. That's how I happened to write that book. I already was sending out another proposal for my next book before this one was published, just to be sure that I would be able to sell it. I had no idea it would hit such a chord.
Was it instant?
Well, the week the book came out, it was featured on the cover of Time magazine, which then was a big magazine.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure that helped, and it got a lot of media attention after that.
Getting your book on the front cover of Time. I'll share with you something also. I've been thinking about this as a fellow author. that you know how this process goes when your book gets to a foreign translation. Basically, the publisher approaches you and says, hey, do you want these terms? And then a foreign publisher, a year or two later, will publish the book. AI is going to be so fun because at that stage of the game, it's going to be every language translation. So no longer having to wait. There should be an automated system. And I think it's going to go a step further where they'll be able to take, I'm sure you've done audiobooks or have audiobooks, and I do. What's going to happen when they can take our voice and have us speaking French or Lithuanian or Vietnamese? And then that's going to be amazing because then it's like, wow, Daniel or Mike, and then you've got all of our books, every language. Oh, I just can't wait. We might be a little bit old to get the full benefits from it, but it's coming. It's coming for sure.
I was talking to a doctor today about AI. He said, AI is so great. It saves us a lot of time, but you know what? It makes mistakes. I'd like someone to read those translations and make sure it's accurate, but it's going to be much quicker. You're right. It's going to change that game. Right now, if you sell foreign rights to a book, they've got to translate it. I don't know how long it takes to translate from English to Vietnamese, but it's a year. It's not months.
Yeah, it takes time.
It'll quicken that whole process, no question.
The whole launch process, sometime in the future, instead of writing the emotional intelligence back in the 90s, is sometime in the future, if you wrote it, the day that you write it, it'll be instantly all languages, instantly your voice on an audiobook in all languages. Wow.
Possibly.
Crazy stuff. Let me get you to sharpen the knife a little bit in terms of emotional intelligence and let people really start to understand the nitty gritty more before we even go into your newest book, Optimal, to really bring them into the idea of it. For me, I always had the quick and dirty way, and I don't know if you like this phrasing, and maybe I'm stuck in my head and I'm wrong, but I always thought of IQ and EQ is the way I remembered things. But I don't think you like the EQ part, do you really? I don't think so.
I don't use that term. I like EI. EQ has become so overused that I'm not sure people really know what it means anymore. I think they use it in contrast to cognitive abilities, which IQ is the star assessment for. But emotional intelligence, I like to think of as nuanced. For example, I have those 4 parts: self-awareness, self-management, empathy, social skill. Within each of those domains, I break out specific abilities or competencies that you see in star performers that you don't see in people that are average, that will require, for example, empathy or self-management. I like to go into a more fine-grained look at what we really mean by emotional intelligence.
I'm not the biggest sports guy now living outside of the States, but there's a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers who was the last pick in the draft, I think last year, and he's now a star. He doesn't have what they would have termed, or all the measurables. Let's compare that to, let's say, the cognitive. He actually has all the cognitive, but he didn't have the measurables, so to speak. But he obviously has that something that could not be measured. And I think to some degree, maybe since your book or even before your book, that the measurement of emotional intelligence, the scientific part of it, has come a long way. Can you speak to, use an example about how we've come to put some, because look, some people might hear this conversation, maybe they've read the book, and they might think that perhaps this is just more squishy. But there is some science here and there's some data here, and it is much more concrete than people might be aware.
There are specific assessments or measures of emotional intelligence. There are about a dozen or so different theories, each of which has a slightly different way of measuring it. Generally, we find that asking people to assess themselves is not as good as asking people who know them well, like a spouse or someone who works with them day in, day out. Asking them to evaluate that person, we get better data from what's called the other assessment rather than self-assessment. Be that as it may, when you talk about measuring emotional intelligence, you're talking about, for example, how well a person can manage upsetting emotions. And other people can see that. Do you get flipped out? Do you get angry? Do you get depressed and down easily because things trigger you or not? Are you pretty unflappable? You can ask other people about that. You can assess how someone else keeps their eye on the goal, a distant goal, whatever it may be, despite all of the things that come up day to day. And you can see this. And there's now lots and lots of very good data, which we summed up in the book, which you mentioned, Optimal, which shows that people who have these abilities are more productive at work, they're more engaged, they're less likely to quit, they are more likely to go out of their way to help someone else and beyond their job description. They tend to be healthier and more balanced emotionally. There's very, very strong data now, what are actually called technically meta-analyses. That's where you take a dozen or 50 different studies and you aggregate them and you see what the sum total of that tells you. And now we have meta-analyses for all the things I just mentioned.
One of the things that you talk about, which I thought was really interesting, and I think I've gotten better at pronouncing his name, and rest in peace, I wish I would have got him on the podcast, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and his concept of flow. It is a great feeling when you can find yourself in that moment, but it's not something that's tenable. We can't stay in the flow state 24/7. I don't know if I wish I could, or maybe I tend to think I wish I could, but there's probably downsides to that. But why don't you speak to that? Because I think that really starts to open up the idea of people imagining if they've felt the flow state, and then you bringing it back to the idea of the optimal state, because staying in the flow state is very difficult.
Flow is fabulous, but you can't make it happen. It's that one time you outdid yourself. Whatever it is you do, you did it at your absolute best, even you were amazed. That's fabulous. And that's what Csikszentmihalyi, which, by the way, I'm impressed you pronounced it correctly.
Pretty good, huh? I get a bonus point for that.
Yeah, totally. It's spelled Csikszentmihalyi. But you say Csikszentmihalyi. Actually, we called him Mike. You'll be interested to know. Mahalya is Czech for Mike, turns out. Anyway, he said, here are the characteristics of the flow state. And he found out that when people described times they'd been at their best, basketball players, neurosurgeons, ballerinas, chess players, didn't matter. They're describing the same internal state. And it's a time when you're 100% focused on what you're doing. Time seems to slow down or speed up. You're in an altered state of consciousness. Things go superbly and you're not self-conscious, no doubts, you're very confident, on and on. I think that's all great, but don't hold yourself to that standard. It just happens or not. Instead, just try to be the best you can be every day. That's your optimal state. And it has the same characteristics. People are focused. By the way, another characteristic is it feels good. It feels good to be in flow, but it feels good to have a good day. People have a lot of small wins, as they're called, toward a bigger goal. You figure out problems that you have to deal with day to day. You feel connected to other people. You feel good. You feel satisfied with how you did. I think that that's a great day. And I encourage people to aim for that rather than for getting in flow. And by the way, one of the things that Csikszentmihalyi said characterizes flow is full focus. But actually, I think that getting focused is a path into your optimal day. It's our distractions which keep us from doing our best. But when we're fully concentrated, then we can do our most effective work. And this has been shown in lots and lots of studies, but I think we know it intuitively. And our distractions, this is really interesting, Mike. The worst distractions aren't the noise from the street, the siren going by, or the people chattering at the next table in the coffee shop. It's our emotional thoughts, the things we worry about, the things that piss us off, that anger us. Those are the big distractors. And being able to manage the internal distractions is critical to staying focused on what it is you have to do right now that matters to you.
I'm 12 hours ahead of you. And I woke up last night early and I knew I wanted to go back to bed, but I tossed and turned for a while. And there was something on my mind and it wouldn't go away for like 30 to 40, 50 minutes. And then eventually I just thought to myself, okay, just try to release. I fell back asleep. There is this constant tug sometimes when you've got some piece of anxiety or something on your mind and it just sits there. And dealing with it this is the cost of being human. But let me ask you a question about distraction though, because you are a keen observer and to think about the different generations. So half of my life pre-internet, half my life after the internet. I've had a smartphone for 10 years, 11 years. I'm right there with everybody in terms of distractions, but I really wonder the different generations. I would guess that the younger generations are perhaps having more problems or having a harder time with emotional intelligence. And let's assume that perhaps their classes and their teachers are not necessarily bringing this up. So maybe they're learning on their own and maybe one day they find their way to your book. But how do you observe the younger generations when it comes to distraction? It seems like they've got an uphill climb, much more than perhaps older generations.
I think you're probably right. I haven't seen good data about it yet, but I imagine it's true because I can see it with young people I know. No one goes anywhere without a phone in their hand pretty much these days. And phones are really helpful and they're our worst enemy when it comes to distractions, because in a moment you can be absorbed in whatever it is that is most seductive for you, whatever makes you most angry, whatever makes you most anxious, whatever makes you most turned on, whatever makes you most this or that is right there on your phone. And it's waiting for you. And I think younger people have grown up, particularly 10 and under or 15 and under, when they never knew a time you didn't have a phone. They never knew another alternative, which I think is why we ought to help younger people by teaching them concentration skills, focus skills. If you give a test of ability to focus to an athlete, it actually predicts how well they're doing the next season. It's really important. I think it predicts how well a student is going to pay attention, a boy or girl in school, how well they're going to absorb what the teacher is saying or what their book is telling them. You have to stay focused to learn, and you have to stay focused to put it into effect. I agree with you. I worry about younger generations. Actually, one of the things I've done over the years is to advocate what's called social emotional learning, which teaches kids the full gamut of these skills in school along with other courses, standard curriculum. So they learn to be more aware of their feelings. They learn to be empathic, know what other kids are feeling. They get along better. There's very good data that shows they're better behaved. They're less likely to misbehave in class, for example. And their academic achievement scores go up by about 11%, which is interesting because that says to me that they're more focused.
Is the modern educational system, K through 12, college, okay, people could end up in some psych classes and whatnot, but is there any part of the curriculum today that's attempting, even though so many people, you, many other people that we've mentioned in this conversation, is there any part of the modern curriculum in America, for example, that is helping kids to understand this type of thinking and understanding early in life? Or is it everything still just, here's the book, little Johnny, memorize it?
Now there are, I'd say, thousands of schools worldwide that are implementing these curricula. There's a very good one that's being offered for free out of Emory University. A lot of European countries offer this education. And by the way, it doesn't really take much. It might be 10 minutes twice a week. But kids love it and they get a lot out of it. There are different ways of integrating this into a standard curriculum. There's no universal curriculum, by the way, in America. Many countries have a top-down, do it this way, and all the schools in that country will do it that way. But more and more schools are adopting this curriculum, and I'd call it life skills, helping kids be able to manage themselves and be better friends, spouses, workers, leaders, whatever. In Singapore, where this is part of the education, they call it workforce preparedness. Singapore is, I think, a corporation disguised as a country.
An offshore tax haven disguised as a country. My Singapore friends, don't kill me.
Mine too. But what I mean by that is that they're very aware of what is coming along that might help their children become better, more effective, more productive, more creative. And SEL, social emotional learning, is one of the things that I understand they've adopted.
All joking aside, you know this as well as I, if most of the planet could have an understanding and an awareness of the world as many people in Singapore do, we'd be in a better place. They've really done a great job over there.
Oh, yeah, I admire it enormously.
I'll share something with you. I'm not tooting my own horn about this, but it's an unusual observation. We'll see how you take it in. But I have a lot of STEM guy friends, let's call them, guys that I would call a touch, I don't want to say nerdy, but just more analytical. And they're fine one-on-one in a group, whatever. But I sometimes observe them observing me. And I can see they're looking at me trying to figure out, what is it about this guy? How is he moving in this world like how he's moving? Because they're not moving that way. And it's interesting to watch their observation because they're very smart. Hell, they're probably a lot smarter than me when it comes to just pure IQ. But I can see there's a hesitation, there's a reservation, I don't necessarily want to jump to where you are, Mike. You can see this on their face. It feels uncomfortable to me to be this open or to be this expressive or to put my emotions out there. It's an interesting observation that I always make of people when they're observing me.
There's a lot of people in STEM professions like computer coding who have really honed cognitive skills, but have underdeveloped emotional intelligence. sadly. And I think maybe that's what you're seeing. And maybe they're looking at you because here's a guy who's gone pretty far with how you get along with people, how you interact. And maybe they don't quite have that skill set because, for one thing, think about it, at least in America, where I presume you grew up, we talk to boys about things, and parents talk to girls, particularly moms, about relationships. So you could say from an early age, girls and women are primed to be more tuned in than guys are. And at the same time, in school, cognitive abilities matter enormously, and you can get very rewarded for being the smartest kid in the room. And that feels good. So you can see how someone would end up focusing on math or physics or computer coding if they're good at it originally, and then they keep practicing it, get better and better, but they don't put much time into people skills.
On this podcast, I'm going to guess I've probably had 75 college professors, psych professors in the psychiatry, psychology on this show, male and female. And I think that's changed me, just to have so many conversations, because you know many of these people. And even if it's just an hour, but it adds up because all these different people from different places, and I've already rattled off some of these names, there's so many more, it changes you. I think what it does for me, even though I'm sure it's been teaching me even more EI over the years, it just keeps me grounded. I've got my views, I've got my opinions, I've got my understandings, but if I have someone on the podcast who could be extremely brilliant, and perhaps they've got some political view that's different than mine, do you throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do you just shut down? And I see this sometimes with some of my perhaps really smart guy friends. They're not willing to bridge that gap. Life is messy, and you can't just cut someone off because they might have a different view here or there.
I hear two different things there, Mike. One is about divergent views and how to manage those conversations. The other thing is, do you learn about emotional intelligence abilities or people skills from talking to people who are experts? And I would say you probably do learn a lot, but I would say the most powerful learning in this domain comes from models, people you know and admire, and practice. And you've done a zillion podcasts now, each one of which is practice. And I bet you were good at this before you even started. When it comes to divergent views, I think empathy is important. Like, there are three kinds of empathy. One is cognitive, knowing how the other person thinks, knowing their perspective, the language they use to talk about things, and that helps you be a very good communicator. That's going to help you when someone disagrees. The other is emotional, sensing how the person feels. Actually, you sense it in your body. That helps you know what the triggers are or what the hot points are for someone. And then the third, which is really interesting, technically it's called empathic concern. Do you care about the person? Maybe that you get how they think and you know what they're feeling. But if you don't care, then you can just maybe manipulate them or create an ad that will suck them in, even though the product may not be in their best interest. This is really interesting. I saw data a while ago about star salespeople showed that they become consultants. That is, they have that third kind of caring for their customers because they realize they'd rather keep the relationship than make a particular sale. So if something isn't the best for someone, they'll tell them. And that's how that third empathy might manifest.
That last one's really interesting because I find myself doing that in life. You might meet somebody in the course of some business transaction, but you realize that that person, maybe a personal relationship, maybe a romantic relationship, maybe a business relationship, it could go a lot farther than that particular transaction, which is how you met. Now, a lot of people I've observed will keep themselves in some crazy confines. Oh, that's just a transaction. I'm not going to think about that person more than the transaction. Whereas if you take yourself out the 37,000 foot view down, you're like, well, hold on. I was just lucky to meet that person. The transaction's one thing, but I'd love to have that person in my life in some way.
And you're only going to get that person in your life if you bring yourself to the interaction and if you are caring. Consider this. Nobody wants to marry someone who doesn't care. Nobody wants a parent who doesn't care. Actually, nobody wants a boss who doesn't care. It turns out I've gone around the world speaking, and I often have asked audiences in different parts of the world, tell me about a boss you loved and one quality that boss had, and a boss you hated. And basically, caring is one of the key dimensions. The boss you hate is aloof, is dictatorial, doesn't care what you say or think, and so on. And the boss you love is quite the opposite.
I want to take it back to the STEM example for a second, because I can think of these days, he's probably pretty controversial, but the world's most successful entrepreneur right now, Elon Musk, seems the classic STEM is tattooed on his forehead. But for me, intuitively, I'm thinking, well, I don't know how. I guess it's possible that behind the scenes, he is a major taskmaster in the sense that he's just a bully and that's how he's got everything done. And there's been some luck involved. That could be the way it's happened. But I would intuitively think that a guy like that, who, again, seems like Mr. STEM, probably has figured out a good deal of your work to get as far as he has in as many different domains as he has. And again, notwithstanding anybody's view about where he might go on some other issues, but just the pure performance and where he's gone, it seems like I would guess that he's got a decent feel for EI for sure.
I hesitate to judge someone I've never met. So the truth is, I don't know. I don't know what it's like to work for him. I suspect that he's really brilliant at seeing where tech is going, and that has been a strong suit for him from the get-go. He's founded businesses that are visionary when you look back, but when you saw it at the moment, probably looked highly risky. And if this is one of the marks of excellent entrepreneurs, is that they can assess their own strengths and what they're able to do. And they know that, so they can bet on something. They can take what looks like a big risk to other people. For them, it's not such a great risk. As an entrepreneur, he's been amazing. So I assume he has that knack.
Yeah, your point taken. It's hard to analyze if we don't know. I was also thinking in advance of this conversation, just the whole idea, and you've already brought this up a little bit, but I was thinking of a song, a favorite song of mine by the band Led Zeppelin. The song was Good Times, Bad Times. Now, I promise you, for anyone who has not heard this song in a long time, put the song Good Times, Bad Times on a stereo and turn it on. The first 2 or 3 seconds, the song is Good Times, Bad Times. Okay, that's not all positive, but you feel positive. And I think that in some ways sums up a little bit of where I come in understanding your world. There's going to be good times. There's going to be bad times. And you can't always be at a super high feeling, but how can you manage this to where the bad times don't knock you off? You can still keep going and you let it go. And one day later, you forgot.
This really comes down to what I call self-management, how you handle your own feelings. And there's a powerful phrase used in cognitive therapy. You don't have to believe your thoughts. Wow, that's amazing. Think about that.
You don't have to believe your thoughts.
It's your thoughts about what happened or what might happen that are making you so upset. And in this approach to therapy, you just see thoughts as thoughts. They come and they go. If you let them go, wow, that is really helpful, because it's when you get stuck in them that they're going to make you depressed, or they're going to make you super anxious. They're going to keep you up in the middle of the night. So one of the great abilities is to let go of the thoughts that are harmful, basically, or that don't help you, to let them go and to bring your mind back to something, for example, neutral or positive. You're in Vietnam. That is essentially the strategy used in a lot of meditations. You think of something that makes you happy or makes you feel neutral, or you watch your breath. And when some other thought comes along and you see that you're lost in that thought, you bring your mind back to that happy place or to that neutral place, and you stay there until your mind wanders off again. Then you bring it back. And every time you bring it back, you're changing your brain. You're strengthening the circuitry for focus. It's like going to the gym. When you do a rep with a weight, when you lift it, every time you lift it, you're making that muscle that much stronger. And it's the same with your brain. If you practice this in a sustained way, it's going to work for you better and better and better.
I've practiced yoga for over a decade consistently. And so many of the teachers, I'm still a baby in a way, I'm pretty good at it, but they get on me about my breath and whatnot. I always look at something like meditation and yoga, and I think to myself, it's so difficult for me to do the meditation. But I have learned that if I can put myself into the yoga class and I can allow myself, whatever I walk into that class, everything's on my mind, whatever, anxiety, this, whatever I'm thinking about. But you go into the class and it's stuck there in your mind. that at some point in time, this interesting practice that has been invented all these millennia ago beats out of your mind whatever is not there. I'm not doing it in meditation, but if I go to yoga, this forced meditation cleans the mind. And I love that aspect of being in this corner of the world.
It may not be helpful to think of those things as meditation because that has a religious connotation. You think of it as attention training. That's what you're doing. And when you do yoga, when you do stretches, when you do different things, you're helping your muscles along. And the more you practice, the better they get. The same with your attention. The more you practice paying attention, the better it gets. It's like practicing pitching in baseball or your tennis stroke or golf stroke. Emotional intelligence is learned that way, through the same way we build any skill, not through cognitive learning, not through, in school, you plug in a new understanding, like, oh, that's how you divide, into a pre-existing cognitive network. But you don't do that with emotional intelligence. With emotional intelligence, you practice empathy, reading feelings from facial expression, and I'm going to see if I'm right. That's a way you might practice.
As you bring this up, I'm thinking to a conversation I had in this podcast with Anders Ericsson, another fine guy who has passed. Deliberate practice, his forte. And he had an example where he, not sure if it was his research or someone else's research, but it was London taxi drivers. And I lived in London for a period of time. And these guys, at least back in the day, they had to memorize the streets. And there was imaging they could do on the brains where they could see at their peak, these taxi drivers, the shapes of their brains had changed for the amount of information they had to maintain to memorize the streets of London. And then it regressed when they retired or whatnot, or they stopped doing it. And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking that there's probably a certain aspect to emotional intelligence that plays the same way, that the better we become at this, the physical structures of our brain probably do change.
You're spot on. I know that study. It wasn't done by Anders Ericsson, whose work I respect enormously. It was a study done, I think, at the University of London. If anyone has been to London who's listening to this, you know that the streets are a maze. They're not a nice grid like in Manhattan. They were laid out by cows, God knows what, but they make no sense, except as a taxi driver, you have to know how they work. The study was a key study in what we now call neuroplasticity, which is what I've been talking about. That the more you practice, for example, the streets of London, or reading facial expression, or managing emotions, the more you practice it, the more you bring your attention back to your breath when it wanders, the more you strengthen connectivity for doing that in the brain circuit. That's the principle of neuroplasticity. And emotional intelligence is learning emotional intelligence totally based on this. Absolutely.
One thing I love too about where your work goes, and especially this applies big to your newest book, is the small wins. Every day we've got to wake up, we've got to manage the day. So how can we treat our minds, so to speak, with a small win? And what is a small win? And I think that getting back to how hard it is to stay in the flow state, I was in the flow state, we won the World Series game, I hit the home run. But for the small wins, how can one manage their day to stay excited and stay happy about the small wins? I'll tell you a fun small win story for me. It happens occasionally. So I was a baseball player into my first year in college. I was a baseball catcher. I was a right-hander, so I wore a glove on my left hand. I still find in my 50s today, if I drop something, my left hand will reach out and grab it before it hits the floor, 9 times out of 10. It's just weird because I did so much of that catching a ball going 90 miles an hour. That's a small win. And that makes me happy and excited to have some small win like that. But I don't necessarily know if that's normal. Unless I talk to someone like you and then share it on a podcast, I don't have this conversation with people to know, hey, how do you think about small wins during the day?
When you were a catcher, you were training your fast twitch fibers in your muscles, which is why they're good today at catching stuff that fell. You use neuroplasticity, essentially. So a small win is accomplishing something that you feel satisfied by that gets you toward a goal that's meaningful. And if you're doing computer code, it might be solving that one little problem that helps you and gets you on to the next one, next challenge. If you're raising 5 kids as a single parent, it's folding the laundry, and that's getting you to raising your kids okay. It doesn't matter what the domain is. The question is, what matters to you, and what accomplishment today will make you feel good. That's the small win.
As you bring up the folding laundry, I have to share a story. So there was, let's just say, a friend, a very accomplished friend who happened to have built one of the biggest brands in the world over the last 30 years. And he happened to have been, he is a man that can do anything he wants, and he's got that resources. And he saw, like many people in Asia, we just hang up the laundry. You do the laundry, you hang it up. I don't like drying stuff. If I dry stuff, it just gets ruined faster. Anyways, he walked in this one room in my place and he was like, oh, you hang your laundry up just like me. It made me laugh because here's this guy. He can hire 1 million people to hang his laundry, and he gets a satisfaction from doing his laundry and hanging his laundry. I thought that was great.
Treasure those things that make us feel satisfied. And you may be surprised if you look at your day, what those actually are. And there may be more of them than you realize.
I have one big picture type question. We've talked about it some, but it's really the learned versus the innate. Do you find that there are some people that just, because I can think of the experiences that got me to the place where I'm at, because I think of the choices that I made, the risks that I took, the embarrassments that I might have felt in some public speaking forum, all these different things that put me down this path to where, okay, I can start to see this back and forth, my own awareness of myself, the empathy for others. Are there some people, do you think, that just have something terribly natural? Are we all learning at some stage? It's not innate. How do you see that, the learned versus the innate aspect of this?
With emotional intelligence, I think it's both innate and learned. Everyone is born genetically different. If you have more than one kid, you see it immediately from day one or week one. They're just different. And what that means is that they have different neurotransmitter set points, you could say technically, that one kid may be more naturally outgoing than another kid. But that doesn't mean that you're frozen there. This is the really good news about emotional intelligence. Wherever you start from, and even in adulthood, it's never too late to get better, to improve whatever it is you want to work on. You just need a systematic rehearsal or systematic training, as you did when you were a catcher. You were retraining your fast twitch muscles, and you still have it because you did it a lot. With emotional intelligence, some people are a little better to start with, or a little worse, but anyone who's motivated, anyone who has a systematic way of working on it and practicing a better way of doing things can get better at emotional intelligence, which, by the way, is unlike IQ, which tends to be around the same through life.
Great points. We talked about 2 books today. We've talked about your first book, Emotional Intelligence, and we're talking about optimal as way today. And I think the way that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the way that I might sum this up, emotional intelligence is presenting, here's this concept, here's these ideas. And what you're doing with optimal is showing people, here's how to apply. Here's an application. Here's how you can use it every day. Would that be a fair way to summarize?
My co-author, Carrie Chernis, and I were co-directors of a consortium for research on emotional intelligence. And in this book, we not only review the research in optimal, but also try to give people tips. For example, how to handle stress. One of the keys there of keeping from burning out, which is basically having an upset and never recovering, and having another upset and the next one and the next one and the next one. That's why people burn out, is to pace yourself, to program into your day or schedule into your day a time to recover and an activity that makes you recover. And by recovery, I mean physiologically getting out of that stress state into a more relaxed, recuperative state, technically from a sympathetic nervous system arousal to parasympathetic. But you don't need to know that. All you need to do is think about, well, what is it that makes me feel good and relaxed? Playing with my pet, hanging with my partner, playing with my kids, walking in nature, whatever it is. Be sure you do it and make time for it. And that's going to help you handle whatever comes your way.
You're very good at this. As we wind down, I will say that you're very good at something that I sometimes don't see on my podcast. I'll speak to many authors and usually very accomplished people. Okay, and they wrote a book. But usually I find is that if someone listens to our episode, they listen to you, they're like, that guy's really interesting. I know Mike is keeping it a little bit of a surface level. He's diving in a little bit here and there. But I like that guy, Daniel. He's interesting. He's got a perspective. I'll buy that book. And I think that sometimes we don't think about that. That's, from my perspective, how books become popular is perhaps the author shares something. The author shares some stories, some feelings and whatnot. And then people are like, well, that guy, I could have dinner with that guy. I could have lunch with that guy. And that bond is what often drives people's interest to take it to the next step, saying, well, hey, I'm going to go check out Optimal. And I think sometimes people think it's the other way around, just throw the data out. But I think people want to feel, they want to feel what's going on, which again, this is a part of emotional intelligence too.
Well, Mike, you're very emotionally intelligent. You're most kind and generous. I'd love to have lunch with you next time I'm in Saigon. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. The book, Optimal, How to Sustain Personal and Organizational Excellence Every Day. Daniel, cool stuff. Is there any place you want to direct people? The book, Amazon, all that fun stuff, but is there a website you might want to direct people to?
Oh, well, if you want a deeper dive into emotional intelligence, Key Step Media, one word, or KSM, has my online learning program. If you want to make your team work better, it turns out teams that are emotionally intelligent at the group level perform better than other teams. And we have a program in Team EI at Goleman Consulting. Other than that, the book is optimal. Get it if you want.
That's the sales pitch. Hey, Daniel, I appreciate it. Keep me posted on future work. Love to have you on again.
Thanks, Mike. It was my pleasure. Really was.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.